Welcome to our next session on human rights and the displaced, and we will share with you three papers for this session. The papers engage with the question of communication within the context of human rights, particularly with the question of displacement. So I will play for you the three papers, and then we can go to the question and answer. Once again, we will turn to our audience here around the room, as well as invite you, our online audience on Zoom, as well as on Facebook, to share your questions there, and we will read those out as well as points of discussion. So let's go to the first presentation. This one is titled Borders of Immobility, Politics of Movement, and Poetics of the Frontier.
It's great to be with you today, even if it's only on a screen. So this is a paper on borders as a medium of communication, or rather a failed communication. What happens when border crossings turn into a nightmare of horrid torment, when the right to movement and mobility is condemned, and when the innocent hope of hospitality morphs into a vulgar flog of inhumanity? Where are we today in the growing dissonance between the promises of motion, circulation, and flows, and the realities of killing borders, ruthless incarcerations, and mass expulsions? The penetrating words on your screen of the Nigerian refugee, uttered in a series of religious chants a few hours after being rescued from a sinking boat off the Italian island of Lampedusa, where dozens perished, remind us of what has become a specter of migration today and the precarity of the border as a regulating artifact of movement in modern society. Some cross borders for leisure, profit, and business, yet others take the risk of crossing displaced by unfavorable environmental, economic, or political conditions. According to the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, about 71 million people were forced out of their home in 2018. An unprecedented 26 million of them are refugees, and half of those refugees are children. Although 80% of refugees move to or settle in neighboring countries, a small number take the treacherous journeys to Europe, the United States, or Australia. Since 2014, the International Organization for Migration has recorded the death and disappearance of 22,000 migrants in the Mediterranean, a figure that could be much higher as many deaths remain unreported. In the Sonoran Desert, hundreds die every year attempting this dangerous trek as well. The aim of this article is to expose the glaring excisions of border politics in a Western imaginary of boundaries, movement, and walls, which breeds mostly a defensive rhetoric and practice of separation, enclosure, and division. Specifically, it will foreground the hideous violence that continues to mark the birth of the modern victim of border crossing, a disposable and suspect body destined to be merely detected, inspected, and classified. This obliteration of the other human at the border becomes a necessary performance to produce the stability of territorial sovereignty and maintain the biopolitics of mobility of our time. More importantly, my argument assumes the failings of our dominant epistemological imagination of the border and calls for a necessary rethinking, a theoretical reframing of the very principles and their assault today by the growing criminalization of the figure of the migrant and the deadly expediency of the border. The desperate lament of the nameless Nigerian refugee on your screen can appear even to the most empathetic as a tragic consequence of a reckless act of crossing a knowingly treacherous border. The humanitarian needs of refugees like him are invoked to alleviate their distress, but very little is done to address the sources of the harshness of life which push people to the edge of their destiny. What conditions of precarity force refugees today to leave their home and families behind and face tremendous risk in some of the most unforgiving places on earth? What possible realities of dispossession and misery impel refugees to subject themselves, their children, and also pregnant wives to the perilous tides of the ocean and the horrific hazards of the desert? What desperation brings some refugees to burn their fingertips, stop speaking, and efface themselves entirely? I do not have full answers to these questions, but I can venture that our growing incapacity to make sense of these frequent scenes of abjection is largely due to the inaccessibility of a proper vocabulary and historical context engendered by a long process of forgetting and policing of memory. This absenting of the effects of colonial history and power machinations of geopolitics and capitalism is what I would call relying heavily on the work of Ann Stoler as border aphasias, a suspension between knowledge and ignorance about coloniality and its aftermath that produces and manufactures incomprehensibility. We lack a semantic ability to understand, to speak of the morbidities of empire, of the incommensurability of the realities at the border, and the natural rights of movement for everyone, regardless of race, gender, or class. The precarity of borders today has prompted Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe to ask a series of provocative questions that force us to revisit fundamental assumptions about the distribution of the earth. How must the earth be distributed? To whom does the earth belong? Who can lay what type of claim to what part of it? To whom should it be allotted what share? And who determines its distribution or partition? In commenting on what he calls a new global mobility regime, Mbembe takes us back to the 1884-85 Congo Conference in Berlin, a pivotal and fateful event, also known as the Scramble for Africa, where Western imperial powers gathered to divvy up large swaths of land and bodies of water in sub-Saharan Africa amongst themselves. The primary function of this conference was to draw up the border and legitimize control and restrict people's mobility along imaginary lines. Today, images of Syrian and Afghan refugees locked in detention centers and caught up in the nativist fervor of countries like Hungary, Austria, Italy, and France reveal a disturbing similarity to the separatist ethos of the colonial border and its inhumane arbitrariness. Wherever we look, Mbembe writes, the drive is towards enclosure, or in any case, an intensification of the dialects of territorialization and deterritorialization, a dialects of opening and closure. This is why I rely on the theory of relationality of Edouard Glissant, a Martinican poet and philosopher who devoted his entire life to the ethics and poetics of movement for a world that defies fixity and sedentarity. I limit my analysis to some insights from his Poetics of Relation, a rich theory of errantry and nomadism that is at the heart of our ontological impasse around questions of mobility and movement. This is a different view from the vertical universality we inherited from classical liberal theory because its premise is on the force of multiplicity and existential creolity, not uniformity and homogeneity. Glissant's view of the border and their function in the world is instructive to illustrate the relevance of his relational thinking to the idea of frontiers and borders. We are drawn to borders, he writes, not because they are signs or elements of the impossible, but because they are places of passage and transformation. Relationship depends on the mutual influence of identities, be they individual or collective, and requires each identity to be distinct and independent. Relationship does not mean confusion or dilution. I can change by exchanging with the other and still not lose or distort myself. That is why we need borders, not as places to stop at, but as the point at which we might exercise that right of free passage from the same to the other, savor the wonder of here and there. The border as a site of passage, encounter, and communication is a central principle in Glissant's theory of relation. Identity is only livable through a relationship with the other. But for this relationship to be able to take its course, it has to be allowed to express itself, to carry itself on its own. It needs the freedom of mobility so that the instinct of relation can survive for all. Motion in Glissant's perspective is not about calculable and economic rationality or about territorial discovery and conquest. It's about a natural transition between various entities, smells, tastes, atmospheres, rhythms, and lived experiences. This projection of mobility and relationality as a necessary condition of being disrupts the homogenizing forces of a border mentality based on enclosures and fortresses. Encounter and transit in this imaginary are the prime qualities that animate our inherent desire for multiplicity and diversity. Without the freedom to roam and meet, our own existence is threatened and our development is stunted. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
A lot there to ponder upon in terms of the ways in which communication props up borders and also the transformative possibilities brought about through communication. The next presentation is titled Palestine, Post-Nationality and Poetic Vision in the works of Elia Suleiman and Mahmoud Darwish.
Hello, my name is Emily Edwards, and I'm a PhD candidate at Bowling Green State University, and today I'll be presenting an abridged version of my paper titled Palestine, Post-Nationality and Poetic Vision in the Works of Elia Suleiman and Mahmoud Darwish. I want to thank you all for being here today in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also a special thank you to the reviewers for their kind and helpful comments. So in my work, I consider the condition of exile in relation to the broader Palestinian-Israeli conflict, whereby Palestinians are rendered refugees and exiles both at home and abroad in the occupied state of Palestine. I argue in this article that the Palestinian national subject, as depicted in Palestinian media such as cinema and poetry, serves as a unique figure with which to consider questions of post-nationality, subjectivity, and cultural production in the context of diaspora. The condition of exile has frequently been theorized as a generative condition, particularly in reference to cultural production and the formulation of cosmopolitan modern subjectivities. Today, I will be presenting an overview of my work, where I place in conversation a selection of work from Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, specifically his autobiographical collection of poems, Why Did You Leave the Horse Alone?, with the work of Palestinian director Elia Suleiman, specifically his semi-autobiographical film, The Time That Remains. Elia Suleiman has been framed as the father of contemporary Palestinian cinema for his critical award-winning body of work, including films such as Chronicle of a Disappearance, Divine Intervention, and The Time That Remains. Comparatively, the late poet Mahmoud Darwish has been noted as the leading poet of the Arab world, including his collections such as Unfortunately, It Was Paradise, and Why Did You Leave the Horse Alone? Looking at these cultural texts, I argue that both Darwish and Suleiman's works mediate a particular yet universal poetic vision, which signals Palestinians as possessing a specific and unique post-national subjectivity and artistic perspective due to their displacement. Drawing here on Najat Rahman's concept of poetic vision. To theorize and connect Darwish and Suleiman's respective works, I apply the work of Anthony Giddens to foreground the postmodern condition as a distinctive self-reflexive project. Giddens, in his work, has argued that, quote, autobiography is at the core of self-identity in modern social life. I also draw on the work of Greg Burris, who has argued for the dynamic post-national possibilities of the Palestinian idea as an anti-identitarian project. As such, in exploring the semi-autobiographical works of Darwish and Suleiman, I consider how these creators mediate, construct, and destabilize Palestinian national identity in the context of postmodernity in their work. The mediation of the exile narrative in both Suleiman's film and Darwish's poetry relies upon three similar themes in both texts, particularly the partition and mediation of temporality outside of national logics, the emphasis on intimate domestic and individualized rather than collective perspectives, and finally, the usage of a series of global cultural texts, in the case of Suleiman, American consumer projects, and for Darwish, religious and classical epics, to signal a universal cosmopolitan cultural experience. Looking at these diasporic cultural texts across different mediums, I employ the method of close textual reading that relies upon a framing of culture as text, thereby facilitating my juxtaposition of film and poetry. In The Time That Remains, Suleiman produces a semi-autobiographical film that draws from his familial experience between 1948 to the present day. Suleiman, the director, also appears playing himself as a character E.S. later in the film. The film is seemingly partitioned into a life cycle, focusing on a father during the Israeli takeover of Palestine in 1948, before moving to a mediation of Suleiman's childhood and adolescence in the late 60s and 70s, with a concluding sequence focusing on his late middle age in the present day. In the film, Suleiman emphasizes a nuanced departure from what Greg Burris has theorized as linear colonialist Zionist time. He achieves a temporal departure from a linear nationalist colonialist Zionist temporal logic through repetition of events, the length of camera shots, and the physical action of actors. Suleiman engages in time play early on in the film, beginning with the 1948 sequence, such as in the Olive Grove scene, which you see here, where men in the village are captured by invading Israeli forces, and Palestinian men from the village are sent to the Olive Grove blindfolded and suspended between life and death. This sense of postponement or deferment visualized in the scene connects to Anthony Giddens' theorization of the self as composed of a fragmented subjectivity in postmodern society. Taking this notion of fragmentation further, I suggest that Suleiman in the scene emphasizes how Palestinian subjects exist in a constant state of deferment of wholeness. Darwish too engages in a similar form of time play in his poems. In Sequences for Another Time, Darwish directly confronts the theme of temporality. We see his deployment of nonlinear logics and similar suspensions and repetitions of time to problematize and critique the Israeli occupation. In one section of the poem, Darwish states, quote, "All is calm at the fork of two rivers. From now on, the days are without a history. There are neither living nor dead. There's no truth, neither war waged against us, nor peace." Despite the sense of suspension and stasis, Darwish in this section suggests, in fact, a sense of generation, peace, and transcendence. All is calm at the fork of two rivers. Several scenes in the film illustrate the way in which Suleiman is able to integrate the enormity of violence of the occupation into an individualized perspective. The neighbor of the family, for example, frequently douses himself in gasoline, threatening to light himself on fire. The normalization and routinization of such violence in the family home and in the neighborhood in daily life portrays the violence of the occupation through a uniquely interior, individualized dimension, which necessarily forces a rescaling of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict away from measurement on a strictly national scale towards the level of the individual subject. In situating his body of work, Suleiman notes that Palestine is mediated not through civic or political labels, but rather through personal subjectivity. Quote, "Palestine is not just a geopolitical specificity, it's something I carry with me. What may be most Palestinian about me is that anti-nationalistic sense," end quote. Comparatively, Darwish's emphasis on personal voice and experience rather than explicit political content has been noted as manifesting specifically in his collection of poems, Why Did You Leave the Horse Alone? The poem Innocent Villagers mediates a more conceptual and intimate form of occupational violence through Darwish's focus on displacement and family. In the poem, Darwish states, quote, "I still don't know my mother's customs or those of her family when the trucks came from the sea, but I know the scent of tobacco on my grandfather's cloak and the eternal scent of coffee since I was born. We also got on the trucks. The glow of emeralds spoke to us through the night of our olive tree." In the poem, we see Darwish memorialize his home and family life, epitomized through the tobacco smoke and the glow of the bright green olive tree that is left behind in his expulsion from Palestine. Playing with highly symbolic objects, here olive trees, Darwish still presents and mourns the loss from an individualized personal context. In an interview, Darwish states that, quote, "The broad meanings of homeland, revolution, and patriotism are composed of fragile elements. Homeland is a broad concept, but when we go to the homeland, we're searching for a specific tree, a specific stone, a window. These components are very intimate and are neither a flag nor an anthem. I long for the little things," end quote. The situation of domestic scenes as key action sites of violent transgression emphasize the interior, personal nature of Palestinian identity and experience. The final aspect I briefly discussed today is Darwish and Suleiman's usage of universal cultural texts and images to evoke a cosmopolitan cultural sensibility. These cultural texts, both religious and American, situate Darwish's poetry and Suleiman's film within a cosmopolitan cultural sphere and push against national cultural designations of cultural objects. While there are numerous visible examples of Suleiman's engagement with these objects, it is a soundtrack where Suleiman blends traditional music from composers and singers with Western popular hits. The final song in the film is a remix of the Bee Gees' Stayin' Alive by Ali El Said Ali, released under the name Yaz as a Stayin' Alive Albercom remix. The obvious meaning of Suleiman continuing on, staying alive, in the face of the occupation is accompanied by a more nuanced suggestion of the power and vibrancy of post-national cultural production, the linking and mixing of cultural forms in Ali El Said Ali's remix. Darwish comparatively employs more traditional universal imagery in the form of religious and classical myths and symbols, which evoke a similar effect as Suleiman. Darwish's poem, like the Nun in Surat al-Rahman, uses religious imagery and symbols to evoke a post-national image. In the poem, Darwish states, quote, "He taught me the Quran beneath the sweet basil tree, east of the well. We came from Adam and from Eve, in the heaven of forgetfulness. Oh, grandfather, I'm the last of the living in the desert, so let's ascend." In this stanza, Darwish speaks specifically on the Palestinian experience, but uses religious metaphors to poetically transcend a categorization of his experience and his body of work as national or post-colonial. To achieve both the poetic and universal, Darwish and Suleiman draw upon these three devices of time play, individual interiority in domestic settings, and a usage of universal or global cultural themes, texts, and objects to position their works as well ostensibly Palestinian, as simultaneously mediating a Palestinian experience that is distinctively post-national, and thus indicative of a postmodern cosmopolitan subject. Both Suleiman and Darwish speak to a poetic vision, but in different periods through different mediums. Suleiman states, quote, "Though poetic image is the only one that can achieve universality." I sought to argue here today that Suleiman and Darwish in their respective works foreground Palestinians as the key subjects of a postmodern age, while I have also positioned the formulation of deterritorialization and exiled subjectivity as creatively generative, which both Suleiman and Darwish attest to in their respective creative processes. Further considerations of the question of Palestinian cultural production, postmodernity, and liberation must also integrate an analysis of class and access. In future works, it is critical to consider the way in which discourses of post-nationality and subjective liberation may be expressed or rendered inaccessible to those who remain exiled behind walls. And that's all I have within time. Thank you all for being here today, and I look forward to answering your questions and discussing things further. Thank you again, and you can reach me either by my email or connect with me on Twitter. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Emily, for that presentation. And again, there's a lot to reflect in there about poetics, the interplays of subjectivity and universality, and particularly when thinking through colonial processes of displacement and expulsion. We will now move to the third presentation, which is my presentation. And in this case, I will share with you the video that I had recorded. And this is within the context of my ethnographic fieldwork with low-wage migrant workers in Singapore amidst the COVID-19 outbreak. Hi, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation on my work with low-wage migrant workers in Singapore, and particularly in the context of COVID-19. I will share some of the key points from my paper on Singapore's extreme neoliberalism, articulated within the context of the lived experiences of low-wage migrant workers amidst COVID-19. Now, to give you a little bit of a context with regard to COVID-19 and low-wage migrant workers, in the early part of the pandemic, Singapore was celebrated by global organizations, including the WHO, for its effective management of the pandemic. However, at a later point of March and going into early April, and then in May and June, the number of incidences of COVID cases started rapidly growing in housing of low-wage migrant workers, particularly in dormitories housing low-wage migrant workers. So in this particular talk, I will make the key argument that the outbreak in the dormitories housing low-wage migrant workers is reflective of an overarching framework of labor exploitation that is systematically erased, rendered invisible, and communicatively inverted or turned on its head by the communicative infrastructure of Singapore's neoliberal capital. So let me begin by talking a little bit about the concept of extreme neoliberalism. I define extreme neoliberalism as the logic of the free market pushed to the extreme, with the key role of the state as a disciplining structure that serves the interests of the market. So here, if you think about the neoliberal logic of rolling back the state to enable the market and rolling out the state at the same time, to refer to the work of Jamie Peck, for instance, in order to serve the interests of the market, extreme neoliberalism works through the consolidation of power in the hands of the state as an authoritarian structure in order to serve the interests of capital, to enable and catalyze at a very rapid rate uh, capital extraction, primitive accumulation, through the exploitation of workers, but also through the simultaneous erasure, obfuscation, rendering invisible of these processes of exploitation. Inherent to extreme neoliberalism, then, is the role of communicative capital as propaganda infrastructure for the authoritarian state and for neoliberal capital. So Singapore's cultivation of the smart frontiers of capital, with its smart seductions of technological innovation, digital futures, artificially intelligent futures, of sustainable city making, um, are sort of all dependent upon the continuous production of communicative capital. And inherent in this production of communicative capital and the infrastructures that produces capital is the labor of low-wage migrant workers from elsewhere of Asia. So in Singapore, largely these migrant workers come from Bangladesh, from southern part of India, from Malaysia, Thailand, and from China. Now, low-wage migrant workers in Singapore usually come on uh, working conditions that are connected to their employers, with the employer having the right to deport them at any point of time. Worker organizing is criminalized. So for workers to express any form of dissent, they run the risk of being repatriated or being placed in jail, being incarcerated. So with this tight control on worker organizing and worker articulation, we also see an infrastructure of surveillance that is deployed by the state in order to place workers under scrutiny. So the COVID-19 outbreak sort of takes place in this backdrop, with um, uh, the ongoing challenges of poor working conditions, often unpaid wages, often bonded labor kinds of situations, because workers have to take in large amounts of debt in order to finance their entry into Singapore. And they often fall into these debt traps in order to um, uh, sustain their families, but also simply in order to survive. So within sort of these conditions, when the COVID-19 outbreak emerges, workers articulate the ways in which the outbreak is connected to the poor housing infrastructure. So in the early part of the outbreak, the state had mandated um, a series of lockdown measures that forced workers to stay within their dorm, and even more specifically to stay within their rooms. So these rooms and dormitories that were housing low-wage workers often had between 15 to 20 workers within a room, and that really increased the likelihood of infection, as well as the anxieties that the workers experienced within the context of the outbreaks taking place. So they talk about how the conditions of the room, with poor ventilation, with lack of adequate space, often workers piled on top of each other like sardines, as they would explain, was situated in the backdrop of communicative inequality. Often, low wage migrant workers reported that they did not have access to communication in terms of really understanding what was going on. So they would witness workers being moved from one room into another. They would witness parts of the dormitories being cleaned out, but then they wouldn't have any information about what was really taking place. So this created the kind of communicative gaps that produced anxieties among the workers and really dramatically impacted their mental health. So on one hand, you have the lack of information, the lack of communication. On the other hand, you have workers being stuck inside the room. This is also then tied to the kinds of pressures that the dormitories experience because of the large numbers of workers that were now staying in the rooms, including the pressures on the restrooms and toilets, with often workers reporting that the conditions of the toilets were dirty, not having been cleaned adequately, them reporting not having access to adequate water to wash their hands, not having access to sanitizers. So these again really created the kinds of conditions where they felt that they could do very little in terms of preventing the spread of COVID-19. So the articulations of the workers also point then to the limits of the behavioral model that is widely accepted in hegemonic approaches to prevention and communication within the context of the pandemic literature, but also the behavioral framework and the culturalist framework that was being promoted by the Singapore state that articulated that the pandemic and the outbreaks were connected to cultural behaviors of the workers of hanging out together, and they continue to point to these structural conditions. Within this backdrop, then, the workers raise the fundamental question that how can one have health and well-being when one continues to live within these conditions of exploitation? So I think, much like what multiple scholars and activists have articulated in the words of Arundhati Roy, the activist, the pandemic is a portal. And what we observe within the context of Singapore is that the pandemic really became a portal for us to witness the large-scale inequalities that constitute the hegemonic infrastructure of Singapore. That actually formed the fabric of its smart imaginary. So, it's worth really thinking through this in terms of the viability of the Singapore model that is often promoted as a model for leapfrogging development into sustainable futures, and to closely interrogate the ways in which worker exploitation of labor are intrinsic to the production of this model. It is within this context, then, it is worth asking what are the possibilities of resistance? What are the possibilities of transformation and social change, especially as models such as Singapore and Dubai are put forth as imaginaries of the future? How do we articulate experiences of worker exploitation, work in solidarity with precarious, low-wage workers to create anchors for social change amidst vast-scale repression and apparatus of surveillance and repression? Thank you so much for watching this conversation. I hope you will read the paper. Look forward to hearing your thoughts. You are welcome to email me at m.j.dutta@massey.ec.nz, and I look forward to an ongoing conversation with you. Thank you. So that brings us to the end of the 3 presentations for this section. And let's open up the floor to questions and dialogue.
It's really, I found it really interesting when you commented on, we have these, these nation states now, like these nation/city states now, like Singapore and Dubai and other places that are propped up by some, not all, propped up by some as these, beacons of modernization, these beacons of industrialization. But that has to be built off someone. If you look to say the World Cup, Dubai and everything, but those stadiums, we have no idea how many people have died building those stadiums. But if you look back historically, we talked about this a bit yesterday. You can probably see historical comparisons. If you look back to the industrial age, when we were industrializing, is that, industrialization in England didn't happen without how many coal miners, how many people in the factories were, how many of the poor folks from Liverpool and other places died. Same thing throughout European countries. Is really at that stage, it was that country, or it was that area that was doing it in a similar way to their own people, and to some immigrants who were brought in, going back even hundreds of years earlier. It's in the Renaissance, the same thing, the buildings being built, they're often built not only by their own, but also slaves brought in from other places. And so we see it throughout history in different ways. So I think that could be really interesting analysis, actually looking at now, we hold up these beacons of like X, Y, and Z places, but if you lift up the sheets, you can see that historically, the same, I don't mean sheets like an American, like sorry, white, but that's also another analysis, sorry. But you can see historical, there's precedent for this, where we do this throughout history, is the ones that are always propped up. Even the US was propped up as being built in the 20th century. But if you look at the railroad were built by Chinese immigrants who couldn't even stay in the same towns. That's why Chinatowns were built in what was considered the dirtiest part of town. And now it's one of the most coveted parts of San Francisco, New York City, and other places. But they had no rights. They're actually legally excluded from the United States by law. And so same thing, but just about 100 years, 120 years back. And so we see the same thing historically. So it's almost like these countries are now having, I don't want to say the same growing pains, not our growing pains, but they're going through the same form of industrialization, but it's a different kind of industrialization now.
Yeah.
They're going through the same thing. There was another article I read recently that was saying that the same thing is happening now, and not industrialization, but the same thing that, Christianity went through during the Crusades and during the Reformation, and during that whole period is kind of what's happening now with Islam as well. So we see the same thing happening with with religious groups. We see one group hits it, another one hits it, another one hits it, and we act surprised. It's I think that'd be a really interesting analysis to look at this and to see it how it's happened other places.
Great point, Stephen. I think, I love your analogy with industrialization or with the railroads.
So look to literature. I mean, if you see in literature, like Oliver Twist was a great example. All of Dickens's work was basically critiquing what was done at that time. And so it's the same thing that's happening now. He was basically culturally critiquing.
Yeah.
And you look to the US, even like Upton Sinclair, the same thing. I mean, they weren't in communication, and they weren't in our field, of course, but they were literary critics of what was happening in the slaughterhouses, in the factories. They were doing the same thing. So their works are great examples of the cultural critique of what's happening. They were lifting the sheets up and critiquing what was happening. And so we have the documents there to show us, and they're wonderful pieces of literature. And they're now critiquing what we consider, almost, besides the Five Eyes, they're like, there are these countries now that are the beacons of democracy. And they went through the same thing.
Yeah.
They're still going through it. But.
I see there are 2 points to what you're articulating, Stephen. So, and these are powerful questions with respect to human rights, exploitation, and displacement, right? One is, how do we witness, how do we narrate what is our role as scholars, poets, storytellers, how do we critique, and then related to that, how do we intervene now at this juncture as this is taking place within these contexts, especially when the appetite of extreme neoliberalism works such that the state is organized to carry out that repression, right? And the second question is, you kind of hinted at this, is the mobility of this model. So the Singapore model or the Dubai model are the models for Western democracies across the globe. These are propped up as models of sustainable futures. So you think of journalists like Fareed Zakaria, who is sort of the beacon of the liberals, and Zakaria loves to love Singapore. And for that matter in Aotearoa, when in the beginning part of the pandemic, we were talking about the Singapore model and its contact tracing apps, for instance. And it's really important to interrogate what are we importing when we are importing that, particularly in terms of strategies of surveillance and control.
It's colonization. Really, these models are colonized. I mean, really, they learned from Western Europe. But the last thing I'll say is, we looked up to Sinclair's work, we looked at Dickens's work. Dickens's work had an impact on Parliament. I mean, basically, the public read it. They got outraged. They got bothered by it. Yes. And he started in the newspapers, and then from there, the serials, and then became the books. And people were like, "This is insane. This is wrong." Yes. And people started to demand action. If you look at Sinclair's work, people read that and they were throwing up reading his book, The Jungle, and that's what people led to action. So if we look to the intersection between poetry, literature, and communication, and activism, and like action research, and like participatory communication, all those areas, I think there's a place for this. It's a matter of, I wonder if now there's too much noise, if there's too much going on, if there's too much happening, where then there wasn't as much attention, there wasn't too much, where now there's just too many voices trying to get attention now, where it's like we have too many journal articles being published, too much stuff going on, where really there's just too much saturation, where really it's like, is everything an academic says important? No. And there's just too much happening, where then there wasn't as much attention for the average person.
So how do you break through the media saturation?
And that's the problem. I think then when they read that, it was so profound. They read Sinclair's work, they were like, oh my God, this has to change. Laws were passed. People had an impact, but now there's just too many people competing for attention. I mean, you see at every university, there's like 6 or 7 people doing the same kind of research. I mean, really, it's almost futile.
Yeah.
So we need to solve that, I think. And we need to get more champions, I think, from our disciplines, and maybe rally around those to kind of learn from history. And I'm done. So I feel like I'm taking over. So
thank you. Were you going to say something?
No, just really food for thought there as well, and just the whole historical component as well. I suppose the Romans as well, my ancestors.
I wasn't going to say that, yes.
I know, I saw your face. But there as well, just that absolute exploitation as well of exactly, even through the back, of local people, but also immigrants coming in as well and making use of them as well. So it's just like history repeating itself over and over. And will we ever learn? Or it just changes format or changes appearance as such, it's just the facade that changes, but deep down it's the same throughout. Yeah. And I suppose we are in the information age. So now it's just, it just explodes, and it's almost become normalized in a way, because everybody, you just reread over and over. It's like, oh, okay, and you just skip that because there's so much information that's coming in. And how do we really stop and be shocked by what's being said? As you were saying earlier, people, you would read these and it's like, wow, this is wrong. What do we do now? It's just like there's so much information that, the media, I suppose, has saturated it completely. And what can we do to actually intervene? And so that there can be a change there.
One of the things that seems like is with this question of the normalization and the saturation and what can we do to intervene, one of the questions it seems like is the strategy of continually depicting these kinds of failures of these models, right? And being super vigilant and critical of it so that we cannot uncritically take these authoritarian techniques of management. And when those percolate into a terroir, for instance, we need to push back. When our politicians hold up these models, we need to push back and document these forms of evidence, I think. So in some sense, I think the key part of this is to recognize, like what Stephen was saying about Dubai and the Olympic Stadium, or what's happening every day in Singapore. Part of that normalization is that our politicians normalize these strategies and at the same time render them invisible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. I like that, yeah. That's what happens, yeah.
I just wanted to comment that I really like how you formulated that pandemic is functioning like a portal for us to witness large-scale inequalities due to hegemonic structures. And because extreme neoliberalism everywhere in the world where it's practiced and used actively relies on so many migrant workers who continuously are put in completely like discriminatory and unequal positions, and they are prohibited from unionizing, or they have different conditions on their visas. So recently I was thinking the bus drivers strike in Wellington, whether it's actually brought by the fact that many previous bus drivers, say from Pacific cultures, from Samoa, actually left when the COVID started, and they went back to Samoa. So now we have a lack of drivers, but at the same time, those drivers are unionized and they can go on strike, while previously migrant workers could not do that. They were scared, they would not join the union, they would not join the strike, and the whole activism of bus drivers fighting for just very simple conditions that they require to function properly and have health and well-being in their lives, and the use of migrant workers by the neoliberal structures in New Zealand, for example, in bus drivers and similar industries, just prevented people from fighting for their rights. And how the pandemic actually made it visible and allowed people to start fighting for their rights.
What a great example.
Yeah, I don't know. I was just thinking, like, why we didn't have those so well organized by union strikes to fight for the rights of bus drivers.
Yes. This also brings up two things, I think, Elena, which are really inspiring in some ways. One is the making visible of it. The other place we saw it was in the fruit picking.
Yep.
And you saw the tremendous shortage, and then you really, again, you wonder, is New Zealand a terroir? Is it so different from Singapore in its exploitative practices? Or is it just like similar to Singapore's propaganda and communicative capital, it is able to hide it and obfuscate it, and the pandemic really made it visible in that way.
I'd say we're a little more like the US in this case, like the old, like the movie or the documentary Day Without a Mexican. I mean, imagine Aotearoa, a day without a Pacific Islander.
Yeah,
I think it's more like that.
Yeah, but also you see, and we don't want to use this analogy, all of these are very similar to the Singapore model because there is an element of repression that builds into this.
Of course, and I would say every culture has that. Right? Every nation has that. Everyone has that, whether they want to admit it or not, everyone has it.
Right. But Stephen, the point I'm trying to make, I think, is that these techniques of authoritarian neoliberalism are not particular to China or Singapore as authoritarian states, but they are actually, like what you're saying, built into
100% agree.
Our democracies.
Yeah, they are. They are. In order for democracy, I think, to exist, what you need, I think, I mean, I think we also, but a lot of people believe democracy is the best form of government. I'll just say it isn't always the most appropriate form of government. Sorry, but it's not perfect. And this is where governments get away with things sometimes, is they can get away with repression because they'll say it's in the name of protecting democratic principles. Well, whose democratic principles is it protecting? In this case,
yes, but they also incorporate those authoritarian techniques. It is just that these techniques are not visible to us. So what you're saying, Elena, is that workers can't organize because the same thing with workers in Singapore, right? They know that they would be deported or they would basically lose their chance of having that wage, right? Another example I wanted to bring up is in terms of the use and throw culture, which is also becoming visible, right? With current immigration policies. With low wage workers, right? And you have seen the pushback with reference to that, right? That sort of these low wage workers that form the bottom of the rung, they're also expendable.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are sometimes there are some extreme examples, or there were some extreme examples before COVID of say workers in fruit picking industry when they were virtually starving, not getting paid, and going only to some authorities when there was no way for them to survive. And when we hear about those extreme cases, we are just wondering what is happening to the majority of those workers, because they have those visa conditions and their labor conditions at the level when they are afraid to talk. So that's the neoliberal, extreme neoliberalism in practice, using those people's labor, but actually preventing them from even thinking of fighting for their rights, for their living conditions, for their well-being.
Right. And you know, the hope within this context then is what you see with the strikes, right? So this is not all hopeless. I think within this context, what it keeps coming back to, and you know, with this work, we often get asked this question, where is the hope? And the hope is in worker organizing and in collectivization and in the traditional unions and figuring out ways of strengthening unions, you know. The other thing also, it seems like this extreme neoliberalism had been brought by sort of, if you think about the 1980s onward, right? That there was no counterpoint to the narrative of capital with the sort of the transformations in Russia, the transformations in socialist economies across the globe. Capitalism seemed like on sort of this turbocharge, the only solution to humanity. And one of the things that we are starting to witness with the portal is a renewed articulation of socialism. And the socialist principles being articulated vigorously by workers, by collective movements, by activists, as alternative registers to think through this, you know. So this notion that capitalism will emancipate you, that false narrative, I think has really been disrupted in so many ways, so that even neoliberal economies today have to talk about well-being. You know, they have to talk about they're finding other language because still you're fighting against that whole propaganda about socialism that has been carried out for the last 3 decades, right? But they're starting to find another language, well-being, good life, as ways of turning to some of these principles.
And one of the last things I'll say, I think some governments are just better at doing it looking like a cute puppy dog, while some look like just a vicious creature while they do it. And I think that's the key thing. Like, you know, having been in Europe, some of the countries there, like, you know, Finland has these same issues, but they look a lot better to the outside and the inside world when they do it.
Yes.
And they look like, oh, we just love you all, we're so great. But they have the same issues when it comes to Russian immigrants now. The prejudice there when it comes to, say, the North African and the African immigrants is rampant. But you don't see that. The sheets are more covered.
So the use and throw is more invisible.
Yes, and even like the prejudice is more covered and hidden. But even in Singapore, I remember submitting an article years ago to a journal, you would know which one. And the editor said, we can't review this because it's talking about prejudice in Singapore, which doesn't exist. I was like, oh, okay. But that's a much more direct assault on, you can't question these things, this is how we operate. And so, but there, it's much more obvious. Like in Dubai, it's much more obvious about what's happening, where the workers are out there working. You can clearly see, like, the towns outside the city center where people are living. You don't see that in other places, like the modern developed European countries or the US or Canada. But even like the beacon, like Trudeau's beacon government, you still have the same problems.
Right.
You still have them. You still have them at Aotearoa, but it's just a matter of it looks shinier.
Yes.
It's shinier,
Yes.
and the other ones are just dirtier.
Yes.
That's
So
the analogy.
Stephen, and I want to point out a little bit also, is that you have to think about how these networks are operating, right? So when you actually have to question, when you have Ardern sitting with Trudeau, sitting with Lee Hsien Loong, talking about social media policies, so really, or if you look at the World Economic Forum platforms, right? You have an Ardern and a Trudeau sharing platform with these managers of Singapore or China.
Yeah.
So and that's where the mobility of the extreme neoliberal policies comes about.
But that's only those two. And then when you add in there also globally, when you add in, say, the former Soviet republics, you add in those issues, or you add in, say, Putin, then you add in now like the Belarus, you add in other aspects there too. The same network even become more complicated. And then you add in others. It's just, it becomes so difficult to untangle.
Yeah.
And then bring in like people like Bolsonaro in that area. I mean, it's just like,
or a Modi. But,
Exactly.
but the point to learn there is that these policy formulations are actually mobile policy formulations. They move from one place to another and back to another place, right? So, I mean, I was working with these activists in India, and they were so surprised that the principal economic advisor to Modi now, who has sort of been driving all these authoritarian, almost neo-fascist, very neoliberal policies like demonetization, where they digitize the whole economy overnight and producing large numbers of people that were out of income because so many people were in the informal sector and dependent on cash. But the principal economic advisor of Modi driving this was, first working in one of the global banks, then was placed in Singapore with the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. So, I like to say all roads lead to Singapore, but I think...
I said all roads lead to Purdue. You said that.
That's a good one.
Let's tell the truth now. Sorry.
all policy roads lead to Singapore.
Okay.
And I think, there is an interesting question here, though, in terms of where this training is happening. Or, if you look at the Lee Kuan Yew School, a lot of like policy people, whether from China or India, they go into the Lee Kuan Yew School to be trained, where they will run these summer workshops. So you have to really wonder what kinds of policy frameworks are being disseminated from there, right? But I suppose all of this connecting back to this session, connects back to this question of when we think about human rights and displacement. I guess the question is, what are the forms of displacement that are being normalized? What are the forms of violations of human rights that are being naturalized in the contemporary policy formations? And more importantly, I guess, like how you point to these being historically, we see these evidences. And similarly, in contemporary context, we see these connections across spaces, right? Like what you're pointing to is that this is not just here, but this is also here. So it's spatial as well. So the question is, how do we build registers for resistance and transformation? Okay. Great. Thank you all so much. Thanks again to our audience. Breeze, are there any questions on Facebook? Okay. So thank you all, and we will be back in at 1:30. So in an hour and a half. Okay.
Thank you.